Sea levels are rising faster than at any time in the past 3,000 years. That is according to a new study by an international team of scientists. The study, which is the first ever to cover such a long-term historic sea level analysis, shows a clear link between rising seas and rising temperatures. Well, Ben Horton is a professor of marine and coastal sciences at Rutgers University and co-author of the report, and he told me more about how they reached their conclusions.
Well, it's a geological detective story. So we have instrumental records of sea level. They come from satellite-based measurements in the last 20 or so years, and we have tide gauge-based measurements, but they're only maybe 100 or 150 years old. So if we want to go back further in time, we need to find a proxy or a substitute. One of the ones that we specialize in is the use of salt marshes. We drill, we collect sediment material. So we take these cores and we bring them back to the laboratory and we look at the geological and biological components within the core. In particular, we look at these single-celled organisms known as foraminifera, and they're very, very sensitive to changes in salinity. So we look at the changes in the abundance of these species, and these tell us the heights of former sea level.
OK, and I read with interest that one of the markers is lead, which is important because evidently that's when the industrial age kicked in. Tell us what you found out about that.
Well, I mean, you're bringing on to a very important aspect of our research. So we're also able to use some of the unique properties of the US Atlantic coast which relate to the European colonization. So when the Europeans arrived along the US Atlantic coast, for example, they changed the agriculture. And we can pick up those changes in agriculture within our sediment cores and tie them to local diaries and almanacs. We can also look at the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution was a huge expansion in the Mississippi Valley, and this put a lot of lead in the atmosphere, which then rained out upon our salt marsh surfaces. We can also use above-ground nuclear detonation, and we can find cesium peaks within our cores.
So let's get on to the figures then of what you have discovered. How much has it gone up by? I mean, it's especially quite drastic, isn't it, since post-industrialization?
Yes, what we found basically is that the rate of sea level change in the 20th century, which averages around 1.4 millimetres per year, is greater than anything we've seen for the previous 2,800 years. We can also look at the period as you move out from another climate warm period known as the medieval warm period, around 1,000 years ago. And for about 400 years, global temperatures cooled by around 0.2 of a degree centigrade, and correspondingly, sea level fell by a certain amount.
So looking forward, what do we do with this information now? Where do we go with it?
The first thing is we can use the model to say, well, what would sea level have been like if humans had not contributed to the climate? And what we find is that over 50% of the sea level change that we see in the 20th century is driven by human activities. But the one thing I would say about our paper to do with the projections that is very clear is that it shows the differences between the emission scenarios and shows what we should be doing. So if we do nothing to mitigate against our greenhouse gases, we just burn as usual, we're getting sea level rise rates of up to 1.3 metres. However, if we do something to mitigate against climate change, if we think of some of the lower emission scenarios, we can keep that global mean sea level to well below a metre.